So I like to tell my students when we first talk about imaginary numbers that for their whole life they've been deprived without even knowing about it. All they ever known about is real numbers. So real numbers obviously are the numbers that we're familiar with, 1, 2, 7, 58, and so on. Those are all real numbers, right? You can see them, you can touch them, so to speak. You can have 7 cats or 8 dogs. I mean, they're things that you can see instantiated in some way. Okay, so what on earth is an imaginary number? Well, here's the best way I think to explain it. Suppose I asked you what's the square root of 1. So another way of saying that is what number did you square to get 1? Because that's actually, let me fix this for a sec. Okay, what number, when I square it, gives me 1? The reason I'm putting 2 parentheses here is because there's actually 2 numbers that you could square. You could do 1 times 1, or you could do negative 1 times 1. So the square root of 1 could either equal positive 1 or it could equal negative 1. Okay, on the other hand, suppose I asked you what is the square root of negative 1? And the answer is there is actually no real number that you can square that would give you a negative, because if you do 1 times 1 you get positive 1. If you do negative 1 times negative 1 you still get positive 1. So there is nothing, at least there's no real number that you could square that would give you a negative. So in order to fix that problem, mathematicians said, okay, well, we can still do useful things with this. And you might wonder, when do we ever use imaginary numbers in real life? 2 examples I can think of would be theoretical physics and also electrical engineering. Electricians use imaginary numbers, something called impedance, which is it's involved in measuring current and voltage of electricity. So they are actually used in real life to model certain things. But in order to get around the problem of having this whole world of numbers involving taking square roots of negative but not having a name for it, mathematicians said, let's give this a name. Let's call it I. And I stands for the imaginary number. So that's what I is. I just means the square root of negative 1. So one interesting thing I want to show you is that suppose we were to do this. Suppose we took I and we multiplied it by itself. So another way of saying that would be I squared. Okay, well notice if I is equal to the square root of negative 1, then what happens if we square this? If we take a square root and then we square it, those two things cancel and we're just left with negative 1. So even though I is an imaginary number, I is the square root of negative 1, that's not a real thing. And you can check that, by the way. If you put that in a calculator, it will probably give you something like this. It'll just say error, it can't do it. Okay, even though I is an imaginary number, it's not real. This right here, this is a real number. Negative 1 is definitely a real number. So that's kind of fascinating that you can take something imaginary and square it and end up with something real. Okay, in this case we ended up with negative 1. So in the next video I'm going to show you how to raise I to different powers, and then we'll do some other problems using imaginary numbers as well.